While I stood crying at my husband's grave, my own son was at my house changing the locks. That sentence has lived in my head ever since that day, repeating like a cruel hymn every time I close my eyes. I thought grief would be the hardest part of losing the man I had shared 40 years with. But grief was nothing compared to the betrayal that waited for me when I left the cemetery. I remember gripping my cane so tight my knuckles turned pale, trying to stay upright as the preacher lowered his voice and the coffin sank into the earth. And all I could think was that I had lost my partner, my protector, my friend. What I didn't know was that in the very same hour, my only son, the boy I carried, the boy I worked double shifts to feed, the boy his father adored, was turning a key in a brand new lock, making sure his mother would no longer have a home to return. 2. The funeral was not the comfort I had hoped for. The hymns rang hollow in my ears. The flowers looked too bright against the grey sky, and every word of condolence sounded rehearsed. I tried to pray, but all I could feel was a gnawing emptiness in my chest. My husband had been a man of quiet strength, the kind of man who came home bone-tired, but still managed to fix the loose banister or rake the leaves before bed. He took care of us through layoffs, through hospital stays, through every storm that tried to bend us. The house we owned was not just wood and brick. It was proof that we had survived in a world that didn't want us to. And as I stood at his grave, whispering promises that I would keep that house safe, that I would keep our memories alive, I had no idea that those promises were already being ripped away by the very child we had raised to understand their value. My son stood a few feet away at the graveside, his suit sharp, his face dry, his phone buzzing quietly in his pocket. He avoided my gaze, and each time I looked at him, I felt the distance like a wall. He had insisted on arranging the funeral, telling me not to worry about details, but in the process, I noticed how easily he spoke over me, how casually he signed documents without showing me, how dismissive he became if I asked questions. I thought it was impatience, maybe even his own grief, but now I see it was preparation. He was already rehearsing the role of decision-maker, already practicing how to take control. On the ride back from the cemetery, I tried to comfort myself by imagining walking into our home. I pictured the front porch, where we had sipped sweet tea on summer evenings, the living room, where the laughter of children and grandchildren had filled the air, the kitchen, where the smell of collard greens and cornbread wrapped around you like a blanket. I thought of sitting in my husband's chair and finally allowing myself to cry in peace, surrounded by everything we had built. But as the car turned onto our street, my heart stuttered. The gate was open, the porch was crowded with boxes, and even from a distance, I recognized the handwriting on those labels. Mine, my books, my clothes, the quilt my mother sewed when I was a baby. Packed, exposed, stripped of dignity. I stepped out of the car, my knees trembling under me, and reached for the door with the key I had carried for decades. It slid in, but would not turn. The brass of the lock was new, gleaming, untouched by years of use. And then the door opened from the inside, and there he was, my son, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, face calm, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Mum," he said, his voice almost cheerful, "you can't be here alone anymore. I changed the locks this morning. From now on, you'll stay with me and Lena. We already packed your things." He gestured toward the boxes like he was doing me a favor. I froze. Hours earlier, I had buried my husband. Hours earlier, I had promised him I would hold on to the life we had built. And here was our son, the one who used to cling to my hand on the way to school, telling me with a smile that my home was no longer mine. I felt my chest tighten, but my voice would not rise. I heard the autumn wind rushing through the rose bushes my husband had planted for me every spring, and I thought of all the years we had worked to prove that we deserved more than scraps, that we could carve out a life for ourselves in a world that counted us out. To be locked out of that life, and by my own blood, was a betrayal sharper than any loss. Standing there on that porch, cane in one hand, useless key in the other, I realized that grief was not the only battle I would fight. My husband was gone, but the house still stood. The memories still breathed in its walls, and I was not about to let anyone, not even my son, bury me alive before my time. The shock of standing on my own porch, locked out of the home I had shared with my husband for nearly 4 decades, was almost too much for my body to bear. I gripped the railing to steady myself, my knees weak not just from age or grief, but from the cruel realization that the betrayal I had feared in the deepest corners of my mind had already begun to unfold in daylight. My son, the boy whose first steps I had celebrated, whose first scraped knee I had kissed, whose education I had worked overtime shifts to pay for, now stood tall in my doorway, declaring with calm finality that my life as I knew it was over. He told me I would not be living here anymore, that I would instead be moving into the spare bedroom of his house, where his wife would look after me, and where I would no longer have to worry about bills, about security, about the burdens of a house too big for an old woman to manage alone. At first, I thought perhaps grief had clouded his words, that maybe he was trying, in his own clumsy way, to express concern. But then I saw the way he gestured to the boxes piled on the porch, the way he spoke with the tone of someone presenting a decision that had already been made, and I understood that this was not concern. This was a takeover. I told him, my voice trembling but firm, that I did not want to leave, that this house was my anchor, that his father's spirit was still inside those walls, and that every corner of it belonged to me because I had poured my sweat and my prayers into keeping it alive through layoffs, medical bills, and endless nights of overtime. He only sighed, as though I were a child refusing medicine, and said, "Mum, you'll be happier with us. You won't have to think about anything anymore. We'll handle everything, the way he said, we'll handle everything cut through me like a knife." I did not need my life handled. I needed my son to see me as the capable woman who had raised him, not as a burden to be managed. But he looked right past my tears, past my plea, and his wife stepped onto the porch, her arms crossed, her lips painted in a smirk that did not bother to disguise her satisfaction. She looked at me as if I were an unwanted tenant being evicted, rather than a mother deserving of respect. I tried to push past them into the house, clutching the useless key in my hand, as though it might magically turn back into the tool it had been for decades. But my son gently placed his hand on my shoulder, not with tenderness, but with a quiet force that made it clear the conversation was finished. "Mom," he said, "don't make this harder than it has to be. We've already packed everything important. Let's just go home now. Lena made up the room for you." His words home now echoed in my ears, mocking me, because the only home I had was behind that locked door. The only home I wanted was being sealed off from me as though I had died alongside my husband. I stepped back, my eyes burning, my voice caught in my throat. And for the first time in my life, I saw my son not as the child I had raised, but as a man with cold ambition in his eyes. Ambition that looked too much like greed. He did not hug me at the graveside. He did not sit with me in silence. He did not ask what I wanted. He only calculated, decided, and executed a plan that stripped me of my dignity before the dirt on his father's coffin had even settled. That realization hit me with a weight I could barely stand, and as I lowered myself onto the porch step, surrounded by the boxes of my life, I felt smaller than I had in years, smaller even than the girl I had once been, walking into segregated schools with my head high despite the stairs. At least then, I knew the enemy was outside. Now the enemy had my blood in his veins. The catalyst was not simply the lock changed or the boxes packed. It was the words he chose and the way he spoke them, as if he had rehearsed this moment, as if he had been waiting for his father to pass so that he could finally set his plan in motion. He told me, with the calmness of someone who believed they were right, that he and his wife had already spoken to an attorney about ensuring my affairs would be properly managed. He said bills, property taxes, and bank accounts were too much for me. At my age, that it was best if he took over, that it was safer that way. He framed it as protection, but in his eyes I saw only calculation. And in my heart I felt the crushing weight of betrayal. My husband had trusted that this boy would be our legacy, that he would honor what we built. Yet here he was, before the flowers at the cemetery had even wilted, erasing me from the home we had fought for. I looked at my sister, who had driven me from the burial, and she stood frozen, torn between intervening and keeping the peace. She whispered to me that perhaps it was only temporary, that maybe he was overwhelmed with responsibility and thought this was the best way. But I knew. A mother always knows. This was no temporary arrangement. This was a coup. The catalyst for everything that followed was born right there on that porch, in the cruel smirk of my daughter-in-law, in the firm pressure of my son's hand guiding me away from my own front door, in the cold gleam of that new brass lock that told me in silence, "You are no longer welcome here." As we drove away, my boxes stacked in the trunk of my sister's car, I watched the house shrink in the rear-view mirror, and it felt like watching my life pulled away from me in slow motion. Every window of that house had a story. Thanksgiving dinners, Christmas mornings, long nights of arguments and reconciliations, the laughter of grandchildren, the soft hum of my husband's voice as he read the newspaper on Sundays. To see it fade into the distance, knowing I could not walk back through its doors, was a grief that layered itself on top of the grief already choking me. The funeral had taken my husband. The porch had taken my home. And my son, the boy I had believed would carry forward our values, had become the stranger who stripped me of both. That was the moment the battle line was drawn, though I did not yet know how fierce or long the battle would be. That was the catalyst that turned me from a grieving widow into a woman who would have to fight, not only for a house of bricks and wood, but for the dignity of a life not yet finished. When I first carried my suitcases into my son's house, or rather when I was shepherded in with my belongings stacked in the trunk of my sister's car, I told myself that perhaps the arrangement would only last a few days, maybe a week at most, until the dust of grief settled and we could all speak with clearer minds. I wanted to believe that my son had acted rashly in the hours after burying his father, that he was not really intending to strip me of my home and independence, that his wife's cold smirk was more about poor timing than calculated malice. But the first nights under their roof made the truth hard to deny, and the pattern that quickly unfolded showed me just how deliberate everything had been. The spare room they had prepared for me was in the basement, a small, damp space with a low ceiling and a single narrow window that looked out at nothing more than a strip of concrete wall. They had placed an old twin bed there with a thin mattress that smelled faintly of mildew, a folding chair, and a dresser missing one drawer. When I asked whether I could move some of my things upstairs, perhaps the quilt my mother had made, or the framed photograph of my wedding day, my daughter-in-law laughed softly and said that clutter would ruin the look of the main rooms, which she had worked so hard to decorate in her style. She said I would be more comfortable keeping my things downstairs where they belonged. It was the word belonged that stung, as though I were some misplaced object to be stored out of sight. The first escalation came not from the physical displacement alone, but from the way decisions about my life were taken over, as if I had lost the right to make them. Within 2 days, my son asked for my debit card and checkbook, assuring me it was only so he could help pay bills and keep track of expenses while I was adjusting. He told me I did not need to stress myself over numbers and paperwork, that he would handle the grown-up responsibilities, though I had been the one handling them for longer than he had been alive. I resisted at first, my voice shaking but steady enough to say no, that I could still balance a checkbook, still write my own checks, still understand what money came in and what money went out. But his wife stepped in with her smooth, professional voice and said she worked at a legal office and knew how easily elderly women were exploited by scams, by fraud, by simple forgetfulness. She spoke as if she were a public servant lecturing me, rather than the woman who had married my son and taken a seat at the table I once set. I wanted to shout that I had not forgotten how to live, that grief had not erased my mind. But before I could gather my words, my son's hand was already on mine, prying the checkbook away gently but firmly, promising that everything he did was for my safety. That night, I lay in the basement, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sound of their footsteps above me, and I felt the first true tremor of fear. Meals became another weapon, though at first it was subtle. They would cook dinner and not call me until the plates had already been served, handing me a portion smaller than theirs and commenting with false sweetness that at my age I did not need to eat too much. They said they were only looking after my health, that older women should watch their sugar and salt. Yet I had spent my entire life preparing meals for my family, feeding not only my children but my neighbors, my church, anyone who came through my door. Food had always been my language of love, but here it became a ration measured out like charity. One evening, when I tried to make cornbread the way my husband loved it, my daughter-in-law wrinkled her nose and said it smelled too heavy, too old-fashioned. And without hesitation, she scraped the pan into the trash, telling me her kitchen had a new standard. My hands shook with anger, but I bit my tongue because I knew that open confrontation would only make them tighten their grip. The basement room became not just my bedroom, but my cage. They kept the door at the top of the stairs locked from the outside at night, claiming it was for security, since the house was large and burglars might break in through the basement. I knew better. The lock was not to keep intruders out, but to keep me in. During the day, if I lingered too long upstairs, my daughter-in-law would suddenly remember a phone call she had to take, or a document she had to review, and she would remind me with a smile that I was free to rest in my room whenever I liked. The implication was clear. My presence was tolerated, not welcomed. It was in those weeks that I began to overhear the whispers, fragments of conversations drifting down through the vents. At first they were muffled, indistinct, but soon I pieced them together into a picture too sharp to ignore. My son spoke of filing papers, of establishing power of attorney, of transferring the deed to the house into his name. His wife coached him, her legal jargon spilling into their late-night talks. Guardianship, competency hearing, mental evaluation. They were planning to strip me not only of my house, but of my very right to decide for myself. Each overheard word was like a nail driven deeper into a coffin that was not my husband's, but mine. A coffin of erasure and silence. One afternoon, I tried to bring up the subject directly. I asked my son if he intended to move into my home, if he was taking over what belonged to me and his father. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Mum, the house needs younger hands. You can't keep it up, and it's not safe for you alone. Think of this as us protecting your legacy." I wanted to scream that my legacy was not his to decide, that I was not dead, that my hands had scrubbed those floors and painted those walls, but he placed his palm over mine and said, "Trust me. It's for the best." That phrase, "for the best," became their shield for every theft of my autonomy. The escalation grew harsher when the bank statements stopped arriving in the mail. I had always opened them, studied them carefully, but now they were rerouted to my son's address. And when I asked, he told me he had arranged online access so I would not have to deal with paper clutter. My pension checks were deposited as usual, but I no longer saw them. If I asked for cash, he would give me $20 and say, "That should cover what you need," as if I were a child asking for allowance. The humiliation of having my own money doled out to me like spare change was a pain almost worse than grief itself. I thought of all the nights I had worked double shifts at the hospital, my feet aching, my eyes burning, just so that one day I could live without fear of poverty. Now I was being told that I was too fragile, too confused, too old to even touch my own earnings. The turning point in this first escalation came one Sunday morning when I asked to go to church. The church had been my sanctuary for decades, the place where my community, my sisters, my elders, lifted me when the world tried to crush me. My son said it would be too much strain for me, that I should rest at home, that perhaps I could watch a service on television instead. I told him church was not something you watched. It was something you lived, something you breathed among others who shared your struggle. His wife intervened, her voice sharp, but still wrapped in false concern, saying, "We just don't want you confusing people with your grief. You're not ready to be around crowds, confusing people." As if my presence, my tears, my truths were an embarrassment to be hidden away. That was the moment I understood that they were not simply trying to take care of me. They were trying to erase me from public view, to make me small, dependent, silent, until the day a judge would declare I was no longer capable of speaking for myself. That night, lying in the basement with the door locked above me, I pressed my hands together and prayed not for strength, because strength was something I already knew lived inside me, but for clarity, for the wisdom to understand what was happening. Before it was too late, I prayed to my husband, telling him I had tried to honor him, to keep faith in our son, but that our son had lost his way, and now I was left to fight a battle I had never expected. The first escalation had already begun, and though I did not yet know how, I promised myself that I would find a way to push back. The weeks dragged into a grey blur where every day looked the same. The dim basement room, the sound of footsteps overhead, the quiet humiliation of asking for money that had once been mine, the rationed meals, the cold tone of my daughter-in-law, and the false reassurances of my son. Grief should have been my only companion during that time, but instead, grief was forced to share its space with suspicion, anger, and the creeping realization that my life was being stolen while I was still breathing. The midpoint of this journey arrived in a single afternoon, an afternoon when I opened an old box that I had insisted on keeping near my bed, a box that contained the last written words of my husband. Inside were papers he had guarded with care, tax receipts, insurance forms, and most importantly, the will he had drafted and notarized years earlier, a will that left the house, the savings, and every tangible asset directly to me. There was no ambiguity in his wording, no loophole, no vague phrasing. His handwriting, strong and steady, confirmed in the margins that everything was mine until the day I passed, and only then would our son inherit. The sight of those documents brought a rush of relief, almost a rebirth of strength, because they were proof that my husband had trusted me to remain in control, proof that what my son was trying to take was never his to claim. For the first time since the funeral, I slept deeply, the documents folded back into the box, hidden beneath the quilt. I believed that with this evidence, I could stand up, confront the lies, and regain my footing. But the next morning, when I opened the box again to read the words once more, the will was gone. The receipts and papers remained, but the thick envelope containing the notarized testament had vanished as though it had never existed. My heart pounded as I turned the box upside down, shaking it until scraps of paper fell onto the floor, but nothing appeared. Panic rose in me, hot and dizzying. I searched through my small dresser, the folds of my quilt, even the cracks between the mattress and the wall, but the will was not there. I knew immediately that someone had taken it, and the only people with access to my basement room were my son and his wife. That day, I could not hide my distress. My son asked me why I looked so pale, why I seemed so restless, and I stared at him with a heaviness I could not disguise. "There were papers in my room," I said slowly. "Important papers from your father. They are gone now." He tilted his head slightly, the way he did as a child when he was pretending innocence, and said he knew nothing about it. His wife interjected quickly, too quickly, saying perhaps I had misplaced them, perhaps I was confused, perhaps grief was clouding my memory. Her voice was smooth, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of triumph, a flicker I will never forget. In that moment, I realized she had likely slipped into my room during the hours when I was upstairs or outside, using the spare key they kept hidden in the kitchen, and she had taken the will into her own hands. That night, I wept, not just for the loss of the document, but for the betrayal that confirmed itself in undeniable clarity. My son was not being misguided. He was not being overwhelmed by responsibility. He was conspiring with his wife to erase me. They were not waiting for me to fade naturally with age. They were building a case to declare me incapable while destroying the evidence of my rights. It was then that I understood this was no longer about hurt feelings or family disagreements. This was a calculated theft of everything my husband and I had built. The midpoint of my story was not only the discovery that the will had been taken, but the realization of what that theft symbolized. It was the turning of the tide from confusion to certainty. Before, I had wondered if I was overreacting, if my suspicions were born of grief and mistrust. After the disappearance of the will, there was no doubt. They had shown me who they were, and now the question was not whether they would betray me, but how far they were willing to go. In the days that followed, I began to listen more carefully, to gather details instead of drowning in despair. I noticed the calls my daughter-in-law made late at night, always speaking in the clipped tone of someone conducting business. I noticed the folders on the dining table containing forms with my name printed at the top, forms I never signed. I overheard her say words like petition and competency hearing, legal terms that confirmed she was using her job at the law office to push forward papers that would place me under guardianship. My son responded with nods and the occasional murmur of agreement, and though I could not hear every word, the pattern was clear. They intended to use the court system to declare me unfit, to seize not only the house, but control over every account, every check, every decision about my own body and mind. It was in this phase that the house itself began to haunt me. My own home, the one locked away from me, appeared in my dreams, its windows glowing warmly as if my husband were still inside, waiting. I would dream of walking up the porch steps, key in hand, only to find the lock replaced again. A new barrier each time, and my son's voice on the other side telling me that I no longer belonged there. The dreams left me sweating, gasping, and when I awoke in the damp basement, the reality was even crueler than the dream, because the lock was real and the exile was not imagined. One evening, while they were upstairs laughing with friends, I quietly asked my sister to meet me outside the next day. She had been hesitant to interfere, still clinging to the hope that this was a misunderstanding, but when she saw my eyes, she agreed. I told her everything: the missing will, the rationed food, the locked basement door, the whispers of guardianship. She placed her hands on mine and whispered that she had suspected, but had been too afraid to name it. She promised to help me watch, to help me listen, to help me gather proof. That alliance gave me back a spark of dignity, because now I was no longer a silent victim waiting for judgment, but a woman preparing to defend herself. The midpoint stands as the moment when the scale tipped, when the fog of grief cleared just enough for me to see the machinery of betrayal turning around me. It was the day the will vanished, the day I knew I could not simply wait for kindness, the day I realized I would have to fight. My husband had written in his own hand that everything we built belonged to me until my final breath. That truth remained, even if the paper was gone. I resolved then that I would carry that truth forward, even if I had to carve it into the very walls of the courthouse. They thought they could erase my voice with locks, with papers, with legal tricks. But I knew then that the story had shifted. The widow they sought to silence had become a witness, and eventually she would become the one to testify against them. The morning I was summoned to court felt like stepping into a world I no longer recognized. A world where truth did not matter as much as the stories people could afford to tell. My son had filed papers claiming that I was no longer capable of handling my own affairs, that grief and age had left me confused, irrational, and in need of guardianship. When I first read the notice, my hands trembled so violently that I could barely hold the page, but my mind was clear enough to understand that this was the betrayal fully realized, no longer whispers at night or papers hidden in folders, but a legal strike against my name. I arrived in the courtroom wearing the same dark dress I had worn to my husband's funeral, because I wanted the judge to see that I was still in mourning, still carrying the weight of loss, but also that I carried myself with dignity. Yet as soon as the proceedings began, I felt the ground shifting beneath me. My son sat on the other side, his wife at his elbow, both of them dressed with the polish of people who had prepared carefully for this performance. They spoke with calm, measured tones, describing me as fragile, prone to confusion, given to fits of memory loss. They told the court that I had misplaced important documents, that I had forgotten to pay bills, that I had been found wandering the neighborhood in tears, unable to find my way home. Each claim was a lie, twisted from fragments of truth. Yes, I had cried in the street the day of the funeral, but who would not, having just buried a husband of 40 years? Yes, I had searched desperately for documents, but it was because they had been stolen from me. Yes, I sometimes paused, caught in memories, but that was not confusion, it was grief. Yet each word they spoke landed with the weight of credibility, reinforced by the professional cadence of my daughter-in-law, who drew on her legal background to cloak lies in the language of concern. What wounded me most was not just their testimony, but the parade of neighbors and acquaintances they brought to support their story. People I had known for years, people who had shared barbecues and birthdays, now stood and claimed that they had noticed signs of decline, that I often repeated myself, that I sometimes appeared disoriented. I wanted to stand and shout that they were mistaken, that they were parroting words fed to them, but the rules of the court silenced me until my turn came. By the time I finally rose to speak, my voice was raw from swallowing outrage. I told the judge that I was not incompetent, that I had worked my entire life managing not only my own household, but contributing to my church and community, that I balanced accounts, organized events, and made decisions every day without confusion. I spoke of my husband, of the promises we had made, of the life we built. But as I spoke, I saw the skeptical eyes of the attorney across the aisle, the way he leaned in to whisper to my son, feeding him cues for the next assault. The unfair twist was that the evidence I once held, the will, the documents with my husband's handwriting, were no longer in my possession. Without them, my words seemed weightless against the papers they produced, papers I had never seen before, papers with forged annotations suggesting that my husband had intended my son to take control earlier. My heart hammered as I looked at those documents, recognizing the style but not the truth of them, and I knew then that my daughter-in-law's hands had been busy not only stealing but creating a false trail. The judge leafed through the file with a neutral face, and I felt panic rise like fire in my throat. When the hearing paused for recess, I sat on the hard bench outside the courtroom, staring at the floor tiles that seemed to stretch endlessly, wondering how a life of work, sacrifice, and love could be reduced to strangers debating whether I was still fit to hold a pen. The unfairness of it pressed down with unbearable weight. I thought of every overtime shift at the hospital, every meal I cooked to save money. Every night I stayed awake worrying about bills so that my son could have shoes, books, and lessons. Now he was standing in front of a judge, telling the world that I was too weak, too broken, too confused to manage the very life I had built with those sacrifices. As the session resumed, the judge turned to me with polite but distant eyes and asked if I had any witnesses of my own, anyone to testify on my behalf. For a moment, the silence was so deep that I feared I was utterly alone. Then I heard the scrape of a chair and turned to see my sister rising slowly, her voice trembling but firm, as she declared that she had seen me handle my affairs, that I was clear-minded, that I was being stripped of my rights by manipulation. Her words gave me strength, but I could see they were not enough to erase the impression left by the polished lies of my son and his wife. The judge adjourned without making a ruling, stating that further evaluation would be necessary, that medical assessments would be ordered, and that until then, my accounts would remain under temporary control. The injustice of that moment was like being buried alive. My money, my house, my choices, all suspended in the air, while others decided if I was worthy of them. I walked out of the courthouse with my head held high, but inside I was shaking with rage. The unfair twist was not only the lies they told, but the way the system listened to them more than to me, as if my age alone made my voice less credible. The gavel had not yet fallen completely, but the sound of its echo rang in my ears like a warning. The fight ahead would not be fair, and justice would not come easily. I walked out of that courthouse with my chest held high, but with a fire burning so deep inside me that it shook me more than the grief of losing my husband ever had. Because now, it was not just about mourning, it was about survival, and about proving to the world and to my own blood that I was not some fragile shadow of myself, but a woman still living, still capable, still ready to fight. The unfair blow of that day, the way the judge's words left my accounts frozen and my voice weakened in the eyes of the law, made me realize that fighting with only my words would not be enough. I needed proof, undeniable proof that no attorney or smug daughter-in-law could twist into weakness. And when the Lord wills something, he puts tools into your path, even if they come from the least expected place. And mine arrived in the form of my neighbor, a woman I had known for years but had never leaned on until desperation forced me to. She was a widow too, older than me by a handful of years, a church sister who had seen more funerals than weddings in her last decade. But she carried herself with that quiet determination I had always admired. One afternoon, as I sat on her porch sipping sweet tea, trying to let the sun warm away the cold shame of the courtroom, she leaned in and whispered that she had something I needed to see. From her purse, she pulled out a small USB drive, holding it like a secret weapon, and told me that her security camera, which pointed toward my house, had captured something on the very day of my husband's burial. At first I thought she meant the funeral procession or the cars lining up, but when she loaded the footage onto her old laptop and pressed play, my breath stopped in my throat. The video showed my son, dressed not in mourning black, but in jeans and a t-shirt, crouched at my front door with a new lock and a set of tools. The timestamp matched the hour when I was standing at the cemetery lowering my husband into the earth. Clear as day, the camera caught him unscrewing the old lock, fitting the new brass cylinder, and pocketing the keys. A few minutes later, his wife appeared in the frame, her arms full of files and folders, glancing around before hurrying inside. They emerged some 20 minutes later, carrying a box, the same box that had held my husband's will, and the look on her face was not grief, but triumph. I wept at the sight of it. Not because I was surprised. By then I knew the shape of their betrayal, but because I finally had evidence to show the world that I was not crazy, not confused, not mistaken in my suspicions. My neighbor clasped my hand and told me she had hesitated to bring it up sooner because she feared the trouble it might bring. But when she heard that they were trying to paint me incompetent, she could no longer stay silent. I thanked her with tears running down my cheeks, holding that small piece of plastic as if it were a key to my freedom. For the first time in weeks, I felt power stir back into my bones. But power without preparation is wasted, and I knew better than to walk into court waving a flash drive like some miracle talisman. I had to be methodical, just as my husband had always been when fixing anything, patient and precise. I took the footage to a lawyer recommended by my sister, a younger black woman who had made a name for herself taking cases others were too afraid to touch. She listened carefully, watching the video twice, then leaned back in her chair with a look that was half satisfaction and half caution. She told me this was powerful evidence of theft and manipulation, but it would take more than one recording to overturn the weight of legal documents already filed. We would need corroboration, testimony, perhaps even a financial trail showing how my pension money was being siphoned away without my consent. I agreed to everything, because once you have seen your child betray you so thoroughly, you no longer cling to illusions that love will heal it. You cling to facts, to records, to anything that strips the lies from their mouths. The days that followed became a secret mission. While my son and his wife believed I was subdued by the court's blow, I quietly collected every scrap of paper they had left behind. Receipts tucked into trash bins, emails left open on the computer when they thought I was asleep, notes scribbled on legal pads. Piece by piece, I built a picture of their scheme. They had not only taken the will, they had opened new accounts in my name, diverting funds to cover their own mortgage and car payments. They had written letters to utilities pretending to be me, requesting changes of address so that bills no longer reached my eyes. They had even spoken to a realtor, floating the idea of putting my house on the market once guardianship was granted. Each discovery fueled me with both rage and clarity, because now I could see their plan from beginning to end. Isolate me, discredit me, strip me of my rights, and liquidate the only inheritance my husband and I had left behind. My lawyer advised patience, telling me that timing would be everything, that if we rushed, they might hide their tracks further. So I waited, biting back my anger each time they spoke to me with condescension. Each time they handed me a $20 bill as though I were a child earning allowance. Each time they told neighbors that they were so proud to be taking care of Mama in her fragile state. I played the role of meek widow, lowering my eyes, nodding gently, all the while keeping my mind sharper than ever, storing dates, amounts, and details. The escalation was not in my anger, but in my strategy, because for the first time, I had both allies and evidence. One night, as I lay awake in the basement, listening to them argue upstairs about money, I realized how much fear had shifted in the house. It was no longer my fear of them, but their fear of being exposed. I heard my daughter-in-law snapping that they needed to move faster, that the longer I remained legally independent, the more chance I had to resist. I heard my son, his voice less steady than hers, asking what would happen if the judge demanded more proof, if someone questioned their story. She hushed him quickly, but not before I caught the crack in his armor. That crack became my beacon. They were not invincible. They were nervous, greedy, reckless, and greedy people always make mistakes. By the time the second hearing date was announced, I was ready. My neighbor agreed to testify about the video. My lawyer had compiled financial irregularities, and my sister had gathered letters from church members attesting to my clarity and leadership. But the most powerful weapon remained that small flash drive, proof that while I was burying my husband, my son was burying me alive in deceit. Holding it in my hand, I felt both sorrow and strength. Sorrow for the boy I once raised, who used to cling to my leg on the first day of school, who used to run to me with scraped knees and wide eyes, and strength for the woman I had become, who would no longer allow even her own blood to strip her of dignity. The escalation was not just about evidence, though. It was about awakening. I no longer walked into rooms with my head bowed. I looked my son in the eye when he spoke lies, and though I did not yet confront him openly, he flinched at the steadiness of my gaze. My daughter-in-law avoided being alone with me, as if she could sense that her mask would slip under the weight of my silence. The house felt different now, not because it was less hostile, but because I carried a new resolve within me. I was not waiting to be saved. I was preparing to strike. And in that preparation, I found a strange peace. For so long, I had been drowning in grief and betrayal. But now I had direction, purpose, even hope. The will may have been stolen. The court may have doubted me. But I was gathering the kind of truth that no lock, no forged paper, no false witness could bury forever. I whispered to my husband at night, telling him that his faith in me was not wasted, that I would not let his legacy fall into greedy hands. And with each whisper, with each plan, with each piece of evidence tucked away, I felt myself rising again from the basement shadows, ready to meet them in the light. The day of the final hearing arrived with a weight so heavy that I felt it pressing on my chest long before I stepped foot inside the courthouse. But this time, I did not walk in as a broken widow stumbling in grief, or as a mother begging for her son's mercy. I walked in steady, my cane striking the tiled floor with a rhythm that kept my heartbeat from spiraling into panic. And though my legs shook under my dress, my mind was sharper than it had been in months. The courtroom looked the same as it had before, the tall windows spilling pale morning light across wooden benches, the air smelling faintly of old paper and polish. But the atmosphere was different, because I carried something my son and his wife did not know I had. I carried the truth recorded in pixels and timestamps, truth so raw and undeniable that no rehearsed speech or polished lie could erase it. My lawyer, that young woman with eyes full of fire, had prepared me carefully, reminding me to keep my voice measured, to let the evidence speak louder than my pain. But I could feel the tremor of righteous anger simmering in my chest, and I prayed that when the moment came, I would wield it with precision rather than fury. My son sat across the aisle, his wife at his side, both dressed immaculately as if the shine of their clothes could blind the judge to the filth of their intentions. He avoided my eyes at first, pretending to review documents, but when he did glance up, I caught a flicker of unease, the smallest crack in his otherwise polished mask. His wife whispered to him, her lips barely moving, her gaze sharp as glass. And I knew she sensed something was different, that perhaps I had not come today to simply defend myself, but to strike. The judge entered. The room rose, and as we all sat again, I folded my hands in my lap and felt the small flash drive pressing against my palm inside my purse like a secret heartbeat. The proceedings began predictably, with their lawyer painting a portrait of me as fragile, unsteady, prone to lapses of memory. A woman living in the shadow of grief too deep to allow rational thought. He presented affidavits from neighbors repeating the same lines as before, claims of confusion, forgetfulness, disorientation. He displayed documents purporting to show that my late husband had intended for my son to take control. Documents that I knew were forged, but that carried the intimidating weight of paper and ink. I listened without interruption, my face calm, though my insides churned. And when the judge finally turned to my side, my lawyer rose and with steady hands began to unfold the truth. She called my neighbor to the stand, that brave woman who had carried the burden of silence until it became too heavy. And when she testified about the camera, about how it faced my home, about how she had seen my son and his wife tampering with my door on the very day of the burial, the room shifted. I could feel the unease ripple across the benches, could see the defense lawyer stiffen, could hear my daughter-in-law's breath hitch just slightly. But words can be dismissed, twisted, doubted, and my lawyer knew it. So she reached into her folder, produced a laptop, and asked permission to play the footage. When the screen flickered to life and the video began to roll, silence fell over the courtroom so thick it felt like a blanket smothering every sound. There it was, my son kneeling at my door, unscrewing the lock, replacing it with new brass while his father's body was being lowered into the ground. There was my daughter-in-law, slipping inside with a bundle of documents, emerging with a box that I recognized instantly. The timestamp glowed at the bottom of the screen, irrefutable. And though the video was grainy, the identities were clear. The judge leaned forward, expression unreadable, while the gallery shifted with gasps muffled behind hands. My son sat frozen, his face drained of colour, his wife's lips pressed so tight they nearly disappeared. The moment the video ended, I felt my entire body exhale, as if weeks of suffocating had suddenly released. My lawyer's voice rang clear as she explained what the footage showed, how it corroborated the missing will, how it revealed not confusion on my part, but conspiracy on theirs. She laid out the financial records we had gathered, the forged signatures, the unauthorized withdrawals, the real estate inquiry made in my name, each piece stacked atop the other, until the weight of evidence towered over their lies like a mountain impossible to climb. When it was my turn to speak, I rose slowly, my cane steady beneath me, and faced the judge with all the dignity I had left. I did not cry, though tears burned at the edges of my eyes, because I wanted every word to land with the gravity of truth. I spoke of the years of work my husband and I endured to build our home, of the long nights, the sacrifices, the prayers. I told the court that grief had not erased my mind, that age had not stripped me of my clarity, that what they called confusion was nothing more than sorrow turned heavy by betrayal. I pointed to my son, not with anger, but with the unbearable sadness of a mother who has watched her child twist into something unrecognizable. And I said, "This is not care. This is theft, dressed in love's clothing, and I will not be erased from the life I built." The room was silent, except for the sound of my voice, and when I finished, I lowered myself back into my seat, knowing that whether or not the judge believed me, I had spoken my truth with every ounce. of strength left in me. The defense scrambled after that, their lawyer stammering, my daughter-in-law hissing under her breath, my son staring at the table as though the wood might swallow him whole. They tried to claim the video was misleading, that the documents taken were for safekeeping, that the lock was changed for my protection. But the words sounded hollow against the clarity of what everyone had just seen. The judge asked pointed questions they could not answer, pressed them on inconsistencies they could not explain, and though the verdict would not come until later, the balance had shifted unmistakably. That moment, watching the lies unravel under the weight of truth, was the culmination of every humiliation, every night in that damp basement, every rationed meal, every stolen dollar. It was the point where the story ceased to be about a widow silenced and became about a woman vindicated, about a voice rising from beneath the weight of betrayal to demand recognition. I saw it in the faces of the people in the gallery, some of them neighbors who had once believed the lies, now staring at me with new eyes, eyes that saw not confusion but courage. When the judge adjourned, promising to deliver a written ruling soon, I gathered my purse with steady hands, the flash drive still nestled inside, and rose to leave. My son did not look at me as I passed. My daughter-in-law glared, but the glare was no longer triumphant. It was desperate. And I walked out of that courtroom into the bright afternoon sun with a lightness I had not felt since before the funeral, because whatever the papers would later say, I knew the truth had been seen. And once truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. The decision came in the form of a written judgment, delivered 2 weeks after that final hearing. And though the envelope looked ordinary when it arrived, sitting in my lawyer's hands across the desk, the weight of it felt heavier than any package I had ever carried, heavier even than the casket that had lowered my husband into the earth. I sat very still as she slid the papers across the table, her eyes steady, her voice calm, but I could see the hint of a smile tugging at her lips before I even began to read. The judge's words, measured and deliberate, declared that I was fully competent, that the petition for guardianship was not only denied, but deemed an abuse of process, and that control over my accounts and property was to be restored immediately. The judgment also called for an inquiry into the financial irregularities uncovered during the case, pointing directly to my son and his wife as the parties under suspicion. As my eyes moved across each paragraph, my hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with the release of tension that had been coiled inside me for months. I read and reread the lines, tears blurring the ink, until the letters swam on the page and I had to stop, pressing the papers to my chest and whispering a prayer of thanks. Walking out of that office with the judgment in my bag, I felt the city around me more vividly than I had in a long time. The air smelled sharper, the sky looked wider, and each step of my cane on the sidewalk echoed like a drumbeat of victory. Yet victory was not a moment of triumphal shouting for me. It was a quiet reclamation, a returning of breath to lungs that had been starved, a gentle but unyielding affirmation that I was still here, still standing, still capable of choosing my own path. My son's betrayal had cut me deeper than any stranger could, and no ruling could erase that wound. But the law had recognized the truth, and in that recognition, I found the strength to continue. The following week, I returned to my own house. My sister drove me, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, her silence heavy with both relief and sorrow. When we pulled into the driveway, I stared at the front porch for a long time, unable to move. The new lock gleamed in the afternoon sun, the same lock that had once been the symbol of my exclusion. But now, with the court's decision and the keys freshly cut and delivered into my hand, it was no longer a barrier. I walked up the steps slowly, each footfall carrying the memory of humiliation, and slid the key into the lock. This time it turned with a soft click, and the door opened to the familiar scent of wood, fabric, and years of living. My eyes filled as I stepped inside. The rooms were quieter than I remembered, stripped of some of their warmth, but the bones of the house remained strong. The dining table stood where it always had. The living room still held the indent of my husband's favourite chair. The kitchen smelled faintly of spice from years of Sunday dinners. Dust had settled, and a few of my belongings had been moved or packed away, but the house seemed to breathe as I crossed the threshold, almost as if it had been waiting for me, patient and faithful, enduring the storm until its rightful owner returned. I set my purse down, pressed my palm against the wall, and whispered, "We made it back." The investigation into my son and his wife proceeded quickly. Banks confirmed transfers that should never have happened. Neighbours testified to the suspicious behaviour they had once ignored, and even colleagues of my daughter-in-law admitted she had boasted about soon having control of property not her own. Each revelation cut deeper, not because I wanted vengeance, but because it showed me how far they had fallen from the values I had tried to raise them with. I attended none of the preliminary hearings. I left that to the lawyers and the investigators. My focus was on restoring myself, on sitting once more in my husband's chair by the window, on replanting the roses in the garden that had wilted during my absence, on filling the silence with the small acts of life that make a house a home. But one evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the walls in gold, I sat alone and thought about my son. I remembered his laughter as a boy, the way he had once run to me with open arms, the way his small hand had clung to mine when he was scared. I asked myself where that boy had gone, when greed had seeped into his heart, when love had been replaced by calculation. The pain of that loss was sharper than any courtroom battle, sharper than the indignity of being locked out, because it was the loss of a bond that once defined my life. I realized then that the court could restore my property, my bank account, my independence, but it could never restore the trust that had been shattered. That was the true cost of his betrayal, a cost I would carry in silence until my last day. Still, there was a strange peace in knowing that I had not been silenced, that my voice had cut through the lies, that the truth had stood firm when everything else seemed uncertain. The women in my church embraced me with pride, calling me strong, calling me an example, telling me that my fight was theirs too, because too many of them knew stories of friends or sisters who had been pushed aside, stripped of dignity, erased in the name of protection. I understood then that my battle was not just my own, but part of a larger struggle, a reminder that black women of my generation carried not only our own survival, but the survival of our families, our communities, and that our strength, even when bruised, could not be denied. As I lay in bed that night, the house quiet around me, the scent of freshly washed sheets filling the room, I whispered to my husband again. I told him that I had kept my promise, that the house was still ours, that our years of labour had not been stolen, that the love we poured into these walls still stood unbroken. I knew he could not answer, but in the stillness I felt something like his presence, warm and steady, telling me that he was proud. I closed my eyes with tears slipping silently down my cheeks, not tears of despair this time, but of release, of gratitude, of survival. The battle was over, but the lesson remained etched in me forever. Trust must be guarded, dignity must be defended, and silence must never be allowed to bury truth. I had walked through the valley of betrayal, and I had returned with my head held high, not because the world had been fair, but because I refused to bow to the unfairness. My son's choices had broken something precious, but they had also awakened in me a strength I thought I had lost, a strength that will carry me through the rest of my days. And as long as I draw breath in this house, the house my husband and I built brick by brick, no one will ever again turn a lock against me.